The morning sun filtered through the faded curtains of Margaret Chen's modest apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor that had seen better days. At 73, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate life's obstacles with grace, her silver hair catching the light as she prepared tea in the small kitchen. The routine had become sacred to her. The gentle whistle of the kettle, the careful measurement of leaves, the moment of stillness before the day truly began. Margaret had built this quiet life deliberately after her husband David's passing 5 years ago. The sprawling family mansion had felt too empty, too full of memories that echoed in every room. She had sold it and moved into this cozy 2-bedroom apartment, keeping only the most precious mementos. David's reading glasses still perched on the windowsill, their wedding photo on the mantel, and the small jade plant he had given her on their first anniversary, now thriving in its corner by the window. The apartment complex was home to mostly young professionals and elderly residents like herself. She had grown fond of Mrs. Patterson next door, who shared gardening tips over the balcony railing, and young Tommy from downstairs who always helped her carry groceries. It was a community she had chosen, one where she felt useful and valued, not like the burden she had begun to feel she was becoming to her only son, Michael. Michael Chen, now 45 and the successful CEO of his own tech consulting firm, had inherited his father's business acumen but none of his warmth. Where David had been patient and understanding, Michael was driven and impatient. Where David had valued family time above profit margins, Michael seemed to view every interaction through the lens of efficiency and return on investment. Margaret often wondered where she had gone wrong in raising him. What crucial lesson about compassion had been lost in the pursuit of success? The relationship between mother and son had grown increasingly strained over the years. Michael's visits became shorter and more infrequent, their conversations reduced to perfunctory check-ins about her health and finances. He had made it clear on numerous occasions that he felt she was living beneath her means, that the apartment was unsuitable for someone of her background, though Margaret suspected his real concern was how her modest lifestyle reflected on his image as a successful businessman. Margaret's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, interrupting her morning contemplation. Michael's name flashed on the screen, and she felt the familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. His calls rarely brought good news anymore. They were usually complaints about her choices or demands that she make changes he deemed necessary for her well-being. "Hello, Michael," she answered, settling into her favorite armchair by the window. "Mom, we need to talk. I'm coming over." His voice was clipped, businesslike, without the warmth she remembered from his childhood. There was something different in his tone today, something harder and more final. "Of course, dear. Would you like me to prepare lunch? I have that soup you used to love." "This isn't a social call, Mom. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at the phone with a growing sense of unease. She set down her teacup and moved to tidy the already spotless apartment, a nervous habit she had developed over the years. 20 minutes gave her just enough time to worry about what could possibly require such urgency, such coldness in his voice. Margaret had always prided herself on being able to read people, a skill that had served her well during her years as a volunteer coordinator at the local hospital and later as David's partner in both business and life. But Michael had become increasingly difficult to read, his emotions locked away behind a wall of professional success and personal disappointment that she couldn't seem to penetrate. As she waited, Margaret found herself remembering the boy Michael had been: curious, eager to please, full of dreams about changing the world. He had been especially close to his father, following David around the office during school holidays, absorbing lessons about business and life with equal enthusiasm. David's sudden heart attack had changed everything, leaving Michael angry at the world and, she suspected, angry at her for not being enough to fill the void his father had left behind. The knock on Margaret's door came exactly 20 minutes later, sharp and impatient. She opened it to find Michael standing in the hallway, impeccably dressed in his usual dark suit, his expression unreadable. He was tall like his father but lacked David's gentle eyes. Instead, his gaze was cold, calculating, as if he were assessing the value of everything he looked at. "Come in, please," Margaret said, stepping aside to let him enter. She noticed he didn't remove his shoes, a small detail that spoke volumes about how he viewed this visit. Temporary, unwelcome, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. Michael surveyed the apartment with obvious distaste, his eyes lingering on the modest furniture, the small television, the humble kitchenette. "Mom, we really need to discuss your living situation. This place is—" He paused, searching for a diplomatic way to express his disapproval. "This place is perfect for me, Michael. I have everything I need here. Everything you need?" He turned to face her, his voice rising slightly. "Mom, you're living like a college student. You have money. Dad left you well provided for. You could afford a proper place, maybe even a nice assisted living facility with activities and social programs." Margaret felt the familiar sting of his words. "I don't want to live in a facility, Michael. I want to live independently, in my own home, surrounded by my own things. I have friends here, a community." "Friends?" Michael laughed bitterly. "Mom, these people aren't your friends. They're just neighbors who tolerate the old lady next door. You're fooling yourself if you think they actually care about you." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure. She had learned over the years not to react to Michael's cruelty with matching anger. It only made him more determined to prove his point. Instead, she gestured to the sofa. "Please, sit down. Tell me what this is really about." Michael remained standing, pacing to the window, and staring out at the courtyard below. "It's about reality, Mom. It's about facing the facts of your situation. You're 73 years old, living alone in a building full of strangers, pretending that everything is fine when we both know it isn't." "What exactly isn't fine, Michael?" Margaret asked quietly. "I pay my bills on time, I take care of myself, I contribute to my community." "You contribute to your community?" Michael spun around, his face flushed with anger. "Mom, you're not contributing anything to anyone. You're just existing, taking up space, using resources that could be better allocated elsewhere." Margaret felt her heart clench at the coldness in her son's voice. This was worse than his usual criticism. This felt like a fundamental rejection of her worth as a person. "Michael, please, what has brought this on? What's happened?" For a moment, Michael's facade cracked, and she caught a glimpse of something desperate in his eyes. "What's happened is that I'm tired. Mom, I'm tired of worrying about you, tired of making excuses for your choices, tired of having to explain to people why my mother lives like this when I'm perfectly capable of providing better for her." "You don't have to explain anything to anyone," Margaret said gently. "My choices are my own to make. Are they?" Michael's voice grew harsh again. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're making choices that reflect poorly on our entire family. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is when my colleagues ask about you and I have to tell them you're living in some rundown apartment complex instead of the comfortable retirement you deserve?" Margaret realized then that this wasn't really about her welfare at all. It was about Michael's image, his reputation, his need to control every aspect of his world, including her. The understanding brought a strange sense of clarity, even as it broke her heart. "I see. This isn't about what I want or what makes me happy. This is about what makes you comfortable." "Don't be ridiculous," Michael snapped, but his eyes avoided hers. "This is about doing what's best for you, even if you're too stubborn to see it." Margaret walked slowly to her small dining table and sat down, her hands folded carefully in her lap. The weight of the conversation was settling over her like a heavy blanket, making it difficult to breathe. She had suspected for some time that this moment would come, the moment when Michael would stop asking and start demanding, when her independence would become inconvenient enough for him to take action. "What exactly are you proposing, Michael?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Michael joined her at the table, his movements sharp and businesslike. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and spread several documents across the polished wood surface. "I've been doing some research, Mom. There's a lovely assisted living community about 30 minutes from my house. Sunrise Manor. It has excellent reviews, 24-hour nursing care, organized activities, restaurant-quality dining. You'd have your own suite, but with the security of knowing help is always available. Margaret glanced at the glossy brochures, noting the staged photographs of smiling elderly residents engaged in various activities. The place looked expensive and sterile, nothing like the warm, lived-in feeling of her current home. "And what does this lovely facility cost?" "The initial entrance fee is substantial," Michael admitted, "but it's a worthwhile investment in your safety and well-being. Plus, think about how much easier it would be for me to visit you there. Proper parking, professional staff, a controlled environment. How substantial." Margaret pressed. Though she was beginning to understand the true nature of this visit, Michael hesitated, then named a figure that made Margaret's breath catch. It was nearly equivalent to her entire inheritance from David, the financial security that had allowed her to live independently these past 5 years. "Michael, that's almost everything your father left me. If I paid that entrance fee, I'd have very little left for monthly expenses." "That's where the beauty of the system comes in," Michael said, his voice taking on the practiced tone of a salesman. "Once you're a resident, your monthly costs are significantly reduced. And if you ever need additional care, the facility has programs to help with that too." Margaret studied her son's face, searching for any trace of the boy who used to climb into her lap to read bedtime stories, who had cried into her shoulder when his pet goldfish died, who had once told her she was the most beautiful woman in the world. That boy seemed to have vanished completely, replaced by this cold, calculating stranger who spoke about her life as if it were a business transaction to be optimized. "And if I say no?" she asked quietly. Michael's expression hardened. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this. You can't live independently forever. Something's gonna happen. You'll fall, you'll get sick, you'll forget to turn off the stove, and then what? I can't drop everything to rush over here every time there's a crisis. When was the last crisis, Michael? When did I last call you for help with anything?" He waved dismissively. "That's not the point. The point is prevention. The point is making smart decisions before we're forced into emergency situations." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine at his use of "we." There was no "we" in this conversation. There was Michael making decisions and her being expected to comply. "What aren't you telling me, Michael?" For the first time since his arrival, Michael looked genuinely uncomfortable. He shifted in his chair, avoiding her gaze, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "You're my son. I raised you. I know when you're hiding something. This sudden urgency, this push to get me into an expensive facility. What's really going on?" Michael stood abruptly and walked to the window again, his shoulders tense. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but no less determined. "Fine. You want the truth? I'm getting married again, Mom. Sarah and I are engaged." Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this explained his behavior. Perhaps he was simply stressed about wedding plans and not thinking clearly. "Michael, that's wonderful news. I'm happy for you, but I don't understand what that has to do with—" "Sarah doesn't want you living like this," Michael interrupted. "She thinks it reflects poorly on the family. On me. She's from a good family, Mom. Her parents are respected in the community, and they have certain expectations about how things should be done." The hope Margaret had felt moments before crumbled into dust. "So you're choosing your fiancée's opinion over your mother's wishes?" "It's not that simple," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sarah has good points about your situation. She's concerned about your safety, just like I am. Sarah has never met me, Michael. She doesn't need to meet you to see that this living arrangement is inappropriate for someone in your position." Margaret rose from her chair with a dignity that belied the turmoil churning inside her chest. She walked to the kitchen and began preparing tea, her movements deliberate and calm despite the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The familiar ritual gave her time to process what Michael had just revealed, that he was willing to uproot her entire life to appease a woman who had never even spoken to her. "Would you like some tea, Michael?" she asked, her voice steady. Mom, we're in the middle of a serious conversation. This isn't the time for tea. There's always time for tea, Margaret replied, continuing her preparations. Your father taught me that. He said that the most important conversations deserve the ceremony of tea. It gives everyone a chance to think before speaking. Michael made an impatient sound but returned to his seat at the table. Margaret could feel his agitation, his desire to rush through this conversation and get back to his perfectly ordered life. She suspected he had expected her to simply agree to his proposal, to be grateful for his intervention in her inadequate living situation. As the tea steeped, Margaret found herself remembering David's words from many years ago, during one of their rare disagreements about Michael's upbringing. We have to let him make his own mistakes, Margaret, David had said. But we also have to make sure he understands that actions have consequences, that the people we love deserve better than our worst impulses. She had disagreed then, believing that love and patience would be enough to guide Michael toward becoming the man she knew he could be. Now, standing in her small kitchen while her son calculated the most efficient way to dispose of her independence, Margaret wondered if David had been right. If they had been too forgiving, too willing to excuse Michael's increasingly selfish behavior as the natural growing pains of a successful young man. Margaret returned to the table with 2 cups of tea, setting one in front of Michael despite his protestations. She noticed he didn't thank her, didn't acknowledge the small kindness. Such courtesies had long since disappeared from their interactions. Michael, she began, wrapping her hands around her warm cup. I want you to understand something very clearly. I am not going to Sunrise Manor or any other facility. This is my home, and I choose to stay here. Mom, you're being unreasonable. Let me finish, Margaret said, her voice carrying an authority that made Michael fall silent. I understand that my living situation embarrasses you and your fiancé. I understand that you would prefer to have me tucked away somewhere that fits better with your image of success. But what you need to understand is that my life is not a reflection of you. It's a reflection of me, of my values, of my choices as an independent adult. Michael's face flushed with anger. Independent adult? Mom, you're 73 years old. You can't keep pretending that age doesn't matter, that you can just continue living like someone half your age. I'm not pretending anything, Margaret replied calmly. I'm acknowledging that I'm 73 and choosing to live in a way that brings me joy and fulfillment. I have friends here, Michael. Real friends who check on me when I'm sick, who share their gardens with me, who invite me to their family celebrations. I have a life here. You have an illusion of a life, Michael shot back. These people aren't your family, Mom. I'm your family, and as your family, it's my responsibility to make sure you're properly cared for. Margaret set down her teacup and looked directly into her son's eyes. When was the last time you cared for me, Michael? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing, not because you needed to lecture me about something? When was the last time you showed any interest in what makes me happy? Michael opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find an answer that didn't prove her point. I'll tell you when, Margaret continued. It's been years, Michael. Years since you've treated me like a person whose feelings and preferences matter. You want to put me in that facility not because you care about my well-being, but because it would be convenient for you and acceptable to your fiancé. That's not true, Michael protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Then prove it, Margaret said. Tell me about my friends here. Tell me what I do with my time. Tell me what brings me joy. If you truly care about my well-being, surely you know these basic facts about my life. The silence that followed Margaret's challenge stretched between them like a chasm. Michael stared at his untouched tea, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. Margaret waited, giving him the opportunity to bridge the gap between them, to show her that somewhere beneath the cold businessman was still a son who cared about his mother as more than just a problem to be solved. Finally, Michael looked up, and the expression in his eyes was harder than Margaret had ever seen it. Fine, Mom. You want the truth? Here it is. I don't care about your little tea parties with the neighbors. I don't care about your volunteer work at the library or your weekly grocery shopping adventures. What I care about is reality. Margaret felt each word like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral, determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply he was wounding her. The reality is that you're getting older every day, Michael continued, his voice growing more heated. The reality is that maintaining this fantasy of independence is becoming more expensive and more complicated all the time. The reality is that I have my own life to live, my own family to think about, and I can't keep worrying about whether you're going to end up in the hospital because you were too proud to accept help. What family are you thinking about, Michael? Margaret asked quietly. Because I'm your family too, and you seem to have no trouble dismissing my needs and wishes. Michael's face flushed red. Don't twist this around, Mom. I'm trying to help you, even though you're too stubborn to see it. But since you want to make this difficult, let me make something else clear. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another set of documents, spreading them across the table with sharp, angry movements. I've been doing some research into Dad's estate, Mom, looking at the paperwork, the investments, the way everything was structured. Margaret felt a cold dread beginning to form in the pit of her stomach. What kind of research? The kind that reveals some very interesting facts about your financial situation, Michael said, his voice taking on a triumphant tone that made Margaret's blood run cold. For instance, did you know that Dad made me the executor of his estate? Not just a beneficiary, the executor. That means I have certain legal rights and responsibilities regarding the management of those assets. Your father left everything to me, Michael. His will was very clear. His will was clear about leaving you the income from his investments and the use of his assets, Michael corrected. But the underlying ownership of Chen Industries, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio, those were structured in a very specific way, Mom. A way that gives me considerable control over how they're managed. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, trying to process what Michael was telling her. What are you saying exactly? Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression cold and calculating. I'm saying that your comfortable little independent life is funded by assets that I control. And if I decide that those assets would be better used to ensure your proper care in a professional facility, then that's a decision I'm legally entitled to make. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Margaret realized that this conversation had never been a discussion at all. It had been a notification, a formality before Michael executed a plan he had already set in motion. You're threatening to cut off my income unless I go to Sunrise Manor. I'm not threatening anything, Mom. I'm explaining the reality of your situation. Dad set things up this way because he wanted to make sure you were always properly provided for, that someone responsible was looking after your best interests. Your father would be horrified by what you're doing, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad's dead, Mom, Michael replied brutally. And he left me in charge of making the hard decisions he couldn't make himself. This is one of those decisions. Margaret stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard where she had spent so many pleasant afternoons reading, where she had chatted with neighbors and watched children play. All of it was about to be taken away from her by her own son, the boy she had raised and loved and sacrificed for. There's something else, Michael said behind her, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice. I've already spoken with a realtor about this apartment. The lease is in your name, but since I'll be controlling your finances going forward, I can effectively force you to break it. The penalties will be substantial, but that money would be better spent on your entrance fee at Sunrise Manor anyway. Margaret turned back to face him, and for the first time since he had arrived, she smiled. It was a small smile, sad but strangely peaceful, and it seemed to unnerve Michael more than her earlier arguments had. You know what, Michael? She said softly. You're absolutely right. Michael's confident expression faltered at his mother's unexpected response. He had been prepared for tears, for anger, for desperate pleading. Not for this calm acceptance that seemed to radiate from Margaret like light from an unexpected source. I'm right? He repeated cautiously, as if suspecting a trap. Yes, Margaret said, moving back to the table and sitting down across from him. You're right that your father structured his estate in a way that gives you control. You're right that I can't maintain my independence without the income from those investments. You're right that you have the legal power to force me into that facility. Michael's frown deepened. Then you'll go to Sunrise Manor? Margaret's smile widened slightly. Oh, Michael. You've learned so much about business and law and manipulation, but you've forgotten something very important about your mother. I may be 73, but I'm not helpless, and I'm certainly not stupid. She reached into her purse and pulled out her own folder, placing it on the table between them. Michael's eyes widened as he recognized the letterhead of his father's former law firm. You see, when your father was setting up his estate, he was very concerned about exactly the scenario you've just described, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. He loved you deeply, Michael, but he wasn't blind to your flaws. He worried that success might make you forget the values he tried to teach you, that money might make you cruel. Michael's face had gone pale. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the conversation your father and I had 2 weeks before he died, Margaret said, opening her folder. He had been watching you, Michael. Watching how you treated service staff. How you talked about people you considered beneath your social status. How you had begun to view relationships as transactions rather than connections between human beings. She pulled out a document and placed it in front of Michael. Your father added a codicil to his will, Michael. A provision that you never saw because it was sealed until such time as you attempted to use your position as executor to override my explicitly stated wishes regarding my living situation. Michael grabbed the document and read it frantically, his face growing redder with each line. This can't be legal. Oh, but it is, Margaret said calmly. You see, your father anticipated that you might one day try to force me into a situation I didn't want for my own convenience, so he built in a safeguard. If you ever attempt to use your control over the estate to coerce me into a living arrangement against my will, all assets revert immediately to a trust that I control completely. Michael's hands were shaking as he continued reading. But this means that if you cut off my income to force me into Sunrise Manor, you lose everything, Michael. The business assets, the investment portfolio, the real estate holdings, all of it becomes mine to manage as I see fit. Margaret reached across the table and gently took the document from Michael's trembling fingers. But here's the truly beautiful part, Michael. Your father knew you would probably try this someday, and he wanted to give you a choice. You can continue as executor, supporting my independence and treating me with the respect I deserve as your mother. Or you can choose to be cruel and manipulative, in which case you lose any claim to the family wealth entirely. Michael stared at her in shock. You're telling me that if I don't let you live in this dump, I lose my inheritance? I'm telling you that your father valued kindness and family more than control and appearances, Margaret replied, and he built his legacy accordingly. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael sat frozen in his chair, his carefully constructed plan crumbling around him. Margaret could see the wheels turning in his head, the calculations of cost and benefit that had replaced any genuine concern for her welfare. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice hoarse with rage and defeat. Fine. Have it your way, Mom. Live in this pathetic little apartment, pretend your neighbors are your family, maintain your illusion of independence. But don't expect me to pretend I approve of your choices. He began gathering his documents with sharp, angry movements. And don't expect me to come running when reality finally catches up with you. I have my own life to live, my own real family to think about. Margaret watched him prepare to leave, feeling a complex mixture of sadness and relief. She had won this battle, but she realized she might have lost her son forever in the process. Still, she had learned something important today. She was stronger than she had known, more prepared for this fight than Michael had anticipated. Michael, she called as he reached the door. He turned back, his expression cold and distant. I want you to know that I love you. I have always loved you. And I always will. When you're ready to remember that family is about more than control and convenience, I'll be here. Michael's jaw tightened. Don't hold your breath, Mom. He left without another word, slamming the door behind him. Margaret stood alone in her small apartment, surrounded by the quiet spaces that held her chosen life. After a few moments, she walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard where Mrs. Patterson was tending her tomato plants. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tommy downstairs. "Mrs. Chen, I picked up some fresh bread from the bakery. Want to share a cup of coffee and some gossip about the new tenants?" Margaret smiled, a real smile this time, full of warmth and genuine affection. She had chosen well, she realized. She had chosen a life filled with simple kindnesses and authentic connections over one of comfortable imprisonment. She had chosen to remain herself rather than become what others expected her to be. As she prepared to go downstairs to share bread and friendship with Tommy, Margaret reflected on the strange gift her son had given her today. In trying to diminish her worth, he had shown her exactly how valuable she truly was. In attempting to control her choices, he had revealed the strength of her convictions. In seeking to make her dependent, he had proven just how capable she was of standing on her own. The afternoon sun slanted through her windows, illuminating the small space she had made her own. It was enough, Margaret thought. It was more than enough. It was home.